today we're going to look at one of the most important transitions in U.S. history. We're going to look at the shift from slavery to freedom to a struggle over what freedom actually meant. And this time period is roughly between 1865 and 1877. This period is known as Reconstruction. And it's not just about rebuilding the South, but what you'll learn after reading in chapter 14, it's about defining citizenship, rights, and power in the United States. So this chapter, here are the learning objectives, and you'll have different learning objectives for every chapter throughout this course. But by the end of reading chapter 14 and completing the activities, you should be able to do these things. Describe the challenges, analyze the influence of President and Congress on Reconstruction, evaluate the changes that took place, and explain how and why Reconstruction came to an end. There are 4 major topics covered in chapter 14: emancipation, national reconstruction, remaking the South, and the unraveling of Reconstruction. In these videos, I don't cover everything in the chapter. I'm just going to cover some of the highlights and give you some insights and some background into what's happening so that you get a better understanding of what you're reading about in the chapter. So I want to look at emancipation, and I want to look at Andrew Johnson and his impeachment, and then I want to talk a little bit about the Reconstruction amendments. So emancipation, kind of freedom in action. I want you to realize that when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, kind of in the middle of the war, it did not free a single slave. A lot of people are like, oh, it's Lincoln's the great emancipator. Yes, he does put things in motion for emancipation to happen and for the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, to happen. But when that was issued, it didn't free a single slave. It also only applied to areas that were in active rebellion. So there were 4 border states, and those border states still had slavery. Slaves were still enslaved in those border states, even with the Emancipation Proclamation being issued. So just keep that in mind. It's going to be the end of the war in which we see laws being passed and constitutional amendments being added to the U.S. Constitution that actually will set up freedom for slaves. So when the war ended in 1865, slavery technically was over, but here's the key idea I want you to keep in mind. Freedom was not simply given. It was actively created by African Americans themselves. So across the South, formerly enslaved people, now freed people, what they were doing was they were uniting with their family members that they had been separated by slavery. We see them begin to build independent Black churches because although they did have Sundays off to attend church, they had to attend typically all white churches, or they had to attend all Black churches, but with white ministers. Now we see we are completely separating ourselves from anything to do with whiteness, right? So we are going to build our independent Black churches. And they also, learning to read and write was illegal for African Americans. And if you were caught reading or writing, there were severe punishments for that as a Black person. So they pursued education at all costs, and everyone was wanting an education, from kids all the way to adults, because it was something that had not been allowed before. So education, the reason that they're seeking this is because it was seen as power, protection, and independence. If I can read and I can interpret things for myself, like the Bible, like laws, like flyers being published, I don't have to rely on someone else possibly lying to me and keeping me stupid. I now have intelligence, right? Beyond just common sense. I can now read and write. And so that's a form of independence. It also comes with a lot of serious challenges, though. We see a lot of violence from white Southerners. We see poverty and disease. And then we also see very limited economic opportunities. So while slavery did end, true equality was very far away, and it was nothing that was ever guaranteed. And you'll see that over the course of this course. Equality is something that has to be fought for, and it's still being fought for today. So after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson, his vice president, who's pictured here, becomes president. And this changes everything. Andrew Johnson wanted a quick reunion with the South. He did not support full rights for African Americans, and he allowed former Confederate leaders back into positions of power in the South so they could still hold political office. In Southern states, they responded by passing black codes. And black codes are laws that really recreate almost like a form of slavery in different aspects of slavery. So they restricted movement, labor, and basic freedoms, and in many ways they do recreate slavery. So there are some vagrancy laws in, like, I believe it's the state of Mississippi, for example, and you can Google this on your own. I believe it's in the state of Mississippi. You had to prove, if you were a freed person, that you were employed. When did we start having to prove employment for anyone? Labor contracts had to be signed. You had to, labor contracts to kind of keep you in this low paying jobs. African Americans couldn't own firearms. They couldn't travel. Owning property, in some places they were restricted to they weren't allowed to own property, or they were only allowed to own certain types of property. So you're going to see this mass exodus of African Americans leaving the South, looking for places where they can buy property. And there's a lot of other black codes that were passed. Congress, especially these radical Republicans, were furious because of what was happening. And so they believe that the federal government must protect freed people's rights. So Congress ends up passing two major laws. One is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and then the 14th Amendment. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it defined all persons born in the U.S. as citizens, regardless of race, color, or former slave status. And we'll get into why that's important in just a minute when we look at the Reconstruction Amendments. And then the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship, right? So this is kind of backing up that Civil Rights Act. It guaranteed citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S. So Johnson vetoed these. He was like, no, I'm not going to let that happen. Luckily, because of our system of checks and balances, Congress was able to override his veto. And that's a huge moment because we see Congress taking control of Reconstruction. We also see the power of the presidency being diminished. And that's really going to come into play when we talk about the Tenure of Office Act. But really quickly, I want to move over, and we're going to come back to that slide. I just want to look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments really quickly. So with these, the 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery in the United States. But there is a caveat to this amendment. You can Google U.S. Constitution. You can look at all the amendments, and you will see this in there. It allowed forced labor, so it allowed slavery as a form of punishment for crimes. And you will see the convict lease system that's talked a little bit about in the book, but you can also research that on your own. We virtually put not just Black people back into a state of slavery, but we also do this to white people who are going to be incarcerated. So incarceration, you can still be in a form of slavery. And we see that. The 14th Amendment, this granted citizenship to all people born in the U.S. This is really big because if you know anything about Black history and you know anything about major laws and court cases, there was a decision made, and it was based on the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave, and he had moved in and out of free and slave territories with his owner. He sues for freedom. The Supreme Court comes back and says, you can't do that because you are Black, and Blacks are not considered citizens. So therefore, you have no right to sue. But what about all those free Black people that were living throughout the North and throughout different territories? So now you've just said that any person of color is no longer a citizen. So this does grant citizenship to all people born in the U.S., with the exception of natives. Indigenous peoples are not granted citizenship until 1924. So it comes a little bit later in history. With the 14th Amendment, it also promised equal protection under the law. This becomes one of the most important amendments in U.S. history because of the precedent that it will set. The 15th Amendment, it does give men, especially Black men, voting privileges. So it decides who can vote. And you can go in and you can read in the 15th Amendment in our U.S. Constitution, it's still in there today, it says male citizens. Those are the ones that can vote. So it does not include women. And there's also some loopholes in that amendment that will allow for voter suppression later on. Even today in 2026, we still have voter suppression happening. So those are some important ones. It does a lot for Black men. It doesn't do a lot for Black women, except for, obviously abolishing slavery. But let's go back for a second and let's talk about this Tenure of Office Act. So now the conflict really reaches its peak. Johnson violates this law that had been passed. Anytime you see act, think of that as a law. So Civil Rights Act, that's a law that is passed. So he violates this tenure of office law by firing a government official without Senate approval. And Congress responds by impeaching the president. Impeachment just means that charges have been brought against you. It does not mean conviction. So he is the first president to face impeachment. He's the first to have criminal charges brought against him. The House will vote yes. They want to pursue this. They want a trial to happen. And they go through that and they see that he is guilty of the charges against him. The Senate holds a trial. And Johnson is one vote away from being removed and convicted. He stays in office because of that one vote. But basically, all that power is gone, and that's where the power of the presidency is diminished. We will not have a strong president until Teddy Roosevelt comes about in the 1900s. So, here we go. Reconstruction in practice. During Congressional Reconstruction, African Americans, they voted in large numbers. They held political office. Here's the first congressmen and the first senators that were African American. They helped build public schools. This was a moment of real progress, but we do see a lot of resistance and strong resistance in the South. White Southerners used violence, such as the KKK. They used voter intimidation. They regained political control, and at the same time, they created a system to keep African Americans in the state of poverty, which is known as sharecropping. And sharecropping often led to debt, dependence, and limited mobility. So the end of Reconstruction, and this is what I kind of want to end on, is by the 1870s, support for Reconstruction began to fade. And there's a lot of reasons, but here are three big ones. Economic crisis, political corruption, scandals, economic problems like the Panic of 1873, and then this growing racial prejudice in the North. And then comes the election of 1876, and it's a disputed election. You can see here how it was disputed. And you'll notice even within the state, it's split, the vote is. So in exchange for the presidency, federal troops are removed from the South. So by giving Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency, a Republican, federal troops are withdrawn from the South and Reconstruction officially ends. And what that means is we don't have Black activism anymore. We don't see a lot of Blacks participating in politics and holding office after 1877. So what does Reconstruction show us? Well, it shows us that freedom is not the same as equality. Laws alone do not guarantee justice, and political decisions shape who benefits from rights. Reconstruction was a moment of possibility, but also a moment where the nation stepped away from protecting those rights. And that decision shaped American history for generations, especially who is participating in politics and who's being left out. We don't see a lot of people of color participating in politics for a long time. It's because they were denied that. So as you move through chapter 14, keep these major things in mind as you're moving through, but then also go back to the learning objectives and make sure you're able to answer those and you understand those by the end of chapter 14.